how thrilled I personally am and the Historical Society is to present Alan Lavalley. He is a senior partner with PAL, which is the Public Archaeological Laboratory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. He did the archaeological dig at Robbins Pond Park, and he's going to tell us what he found. You will be amazed, and it is a thrill to see it. Just as far as the history of the town is concerned, you can tell I'm bubbly about it. He is also a professor of anthropology at the Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, too. So you go to it.
Thank you. Thank you. Being an archaeologist in New England is a little bit of detective work, a little bit of academic work, but a lot of imagination, a lot of common sense, meeting good people, finding interesting places to do work. I'd like to say that I'm the kind of archaeologist that can go anywhere in the world and just kind of begin digging and doing research. That's not the case anymore. Everybody becomes a specialist in a time and place. And I figured, because I had a family here in Rhode Island, nearby Rhode Island, that I wanted to work in New England. So my area of specialty is New England, and my particular research interest is Native American peoples of the distant past. When I introduced myself, I should have said what I really am is a tour guide, and I'm a tour guide in time and place. So having that job, I sometimes jump around, so you're just going to have to try to stay with me. Never quite know what you're going to get. Sometimes we can dig 600 or 700 test pits in a project area and find absolutely nothing. And we spend $10,000 or $15,000 of somebody's money and end up with a report, the last page of which says, and nothing was really found. That's not the case in the discussion that we're going to have tonight. So we got into the story, or the many stories about Robbins Pond, found it fascinating and found it very difficult to walk away from at times. And I have to say thank you very much to the Historical Commission. I have to say thank you very much to the library here. I spent some time here doing research. I have to say thank you to folks like Fred Lawless and Gil Solomon of the Punkapunk Indian tribe, and other folks who shared anecdotes with me. Fred, as a matter of fact, had some fascinating stories, and he's somebody that probably should be up in front of you tonight, because he's a better authority at what he's done out on the site than what I've done out on the site. This is a landscape that has been the stage for mystery, intrigue, romance, illegal activity, criminal activity, all around the families that owned, occupied, or were associated with Robbins Pond. We began the archaeological investigations here. Again, you're probably more familiar with it than I am. We can characterize it as a beautiful and special place. Anybody who's been there immediately gets a sense of place, a sense of this is a place, and this is not an indictment against any developers, but this is a place you would like to see pristine and kept as it is for as long as possible. Whether or not that's a reality, we don't know, because progress and change is always happening on us, as we all know. But it is a lovely place with viewscapes, with a very special aura to it, if you will, for lack of a better term. It's a nice place to spend some time. And I and some of my colleagues, this individual, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but he is a specialist. His name is Dan Lynch from Western Michigan University, and he is a specialist in ground penetrating radar. Now, it's not like Jurassic Park, where you see a picture of a dinosaur on the screen. And we were not looking for dinosaurs at Robbins Pond. What we were looking for, using ground penetrating radar, and I'm a little bit ahead of myself, but possible burials, possible Indian family graveyard that is referenced in a number of historical documents and was also referenced in oral traditions. Again, I'll probably mention Fred's name, embarrass him several times tonight, but he is one of a number of individuals who, a chain of oral tradition of people who actually remembered locations of graveyards. Now, things get shrouded a little bit in history, and it becomes a needle in a haystack to find an individual grave, or even sometimes a cluster of 10 or so graves, especially when a landscape has undergone so many changes. And that became the case out here. So we tried a number of different ways to answer a question as whether or not there's still remnant graves out there. And that is because, aside from the importance of an archaeological site, human burials have a whole special set of laws that apply to them, understandably, and have to be taken into consideration a little bit differently than the archaeological remains and materials. This is, for those of you who have not been there recently, this is the landscape setting. We are on the northern, the northwestern corner of Robbins Pond. It is an undulating topography, but one that is dominated by a slightly elevated terrace that commands an impressive view of the pond itself. It's not rocket science. It's a beautiful place now. It was a beautiful place 4,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago. And humans have been attracted to it for that amount of time. We knew that from the collections. There's a collection here upstairs, that way I think, and upstairs. And it is a small collection from the Robbins Pond area that includes Native American stone tools, lithic materials. And as I said before, there are a number of collectors who had been here before us. So we knew that materials were here. But the very first place you do go when you do an archaeological examination is into the archives, into the Massachusetts State Archives in Boston, into the local archives at towns and in libraries, and you do your homework. The deed work had been done here because this is a piece of parcel of property that you probably, again, know better than I, has changed hands many times over the last several hundred years. And being legal documents, the deeds, the information that is passed down is investigated as an element of land transfers. A developer wants to know what he's buying. So deed research, and supplemented and complemented by the research that PAL had done, had found that the Robbins Pond area draws its name from a David Robbins and his extended family, David Robbins being of Native American affiliation and origin and residing in close proximity to the pond. So these are a series of 19th century maps, one of which actually refers to it being in proximity to the homestead of David Robinson, the Indian. And these are deed transfers just at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, in which there are specific references to the Robbins family burial place. And actually, there are even references, if you'll forgive me to put my glasses on here, that describe, to some extent, where it is located, so many rods from the crossing at the river and into the project area. So we were able to do a little bit of translation from the old surveying technologies to the new, and draw a circle, if you will, around where we believed it was most likely that remnants of the burial ground would still be found. Now, we were getting hints throughout the investigations, even as we were collecting the documentary information, that burials had been encountered by avocational archaeologists and those looking for materials, and one of them, two of them, possibly all of them could have been impacted and removed without any of us really finding out about it or knowing about it in the 21st century. So we couldn't eliminate the possibility that they're not there, but we couldn't, we didn't want to work from a negative. If they were there, we wanted to make every effort to find them. And as we were doing the background research, as I indicated, talking to Fred Lawless, Howard Lothrop, Gil Solomon, and other folks, we were able to put together and these are the materials that are upstairs actually. And Fred is here and back there. And we were able to put together the baseline information that yes, a lot of activity had taken place here, a lot of landscape changes. Margaret made reference in the beginning of the talk to the advertisement for the amusement park that was here. Obviously, landscape changes were made then, when this was a campground. A lot of landscape changes. There are utilities out there. There are bathroom facilities, independent sewer facilities. There are gravel pits out there. There are buried 55-gallon half drums that were fire pits in the 1920s and 1930s. There are drainage lines. Yes, all of those things have taken place there. So the question for us going into initial investigations was, we know that this was an important site because a lot of stuff, a lot of artifacts were coming out of it, and they were impressive collections. So we know that a lot of people were here in the past doing a lot of activities. The question was, did anything survive all of the historic period changes that were going on there? When we as Europeans took over the property, if you will, and changed it so radically. What's left? Anything? And the developers, God bless them, always hope that there's nothing there, that they like nothing better than for you to find nothing, or when you do find something, to find that it's been disturbed. So they are waiting patiently, paying us, and waiting patiently to hopefully hear that, well, yes, it is so disturbed that there's no possibility for anything to be out there. And the curse of an archaeologist, any professional archaeologist, or anybody worth his soul that has any kind of ology at the end of his name, the curse of that profession is to be objective and to be honest. And that's probably why none of us are very wealthy, but it's why some of us are still working. You can't see this very well, so you'll just have to take my word for it, that this is a graphic representation of the outline of the project area. With Robbins Pond here, north is this way, this is the road, and this is essentially where the developer had proposed to do the development. So the first thing we do as archaeologists is to go out and do a series of test pits. We dig nice square holes in the ground. We think in metrics. Your children and grandchildren can think in metrics. You probably think pretty much in feet, in inches so far. So it's about 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet square, and 1.5 to 2.5 feet deep. And we dig in 2.5 inches, and we take all the dirt and we sift it through 1/4 inch screening or mesh, and then we look very carefully at everything that remains in the screen. And across the Robbins Pond site, we did this in a series of what we call systematic transects. And all that means is about every 30 feet or so, along a generally straight line, through representative sections of the project area, we dig these test pits. And somewhere here, it begins to say, I forget exactly how many, I don't want to lie to you, so I won't give you a number. Maybe it'll be written down here somewhere and you'll catch it before I race past it. But the answer is we did find material. And the question is, what did we find and where did we find it? Well, we found it spread thinly throughout the project area with a couple of concentrated areas. But more importantly, we found it in areas that, yes, there were a lot of areas that were, to use the vernacular, blown away, that were disturbed and destroyed. But we did find other areas that had a nice layer cake soil stratigraphy, about 12 or 13 inches of plow zone. This is nice sandy, well-drained soils. And before the beautiful pines that we know are out there now were planted there after the turn of the century, around the time of the Civil War, this was all open land, and it was farmed, so there's a plow zone. Farming and plowing the land kind of homogenizes the top 12 inches, and we found that in many places still intact, and below that we found nice glacially deposited soils that were deposited here probably between 17 and 19,000 years ago as the Wisconsin Glacier melted and receded north. So we found, for lack of a better term, generally pristine, meaningful soil conditions that were similar, somewhat altered, but similar to what they had been like for the last 9 or 10,000 years out on the site. So that told us we had the potential to find any archaeological materials from Native American occupation there that would have resulted from any number of different occupations of the site. Several of them are referred to just because of the proximity. Again, I'm getting old, we have bad memories, so we have to name things after name the sites after familiar places. So we get something called the Pond Street site that's right along Pond Street. We get the tennis court site that's right along the tennis courts, those kinds of things. We found 4 or 5 different clusters of materials, some of which, in particular the Robbins Pond site, which is in close proximity to Robbins Pond, was in particularly good condition. And I'll show you some slides of the subsurface condition. And just to give you a little bit of numbers, we did find 416 artifacts. Now, not every artifact, this is a tool. This is a stone tool. It's called an adze. And somewhere floating around the room is one of these. Now, I'm going to go all over the place here, so please stay with me. But Native Americans were excellent seat-of-the-pants field geologists. They knew stone better than most of us in the room know stone. How it worked, how it was yielding, what kind of cutting tool it would make, what kind of grinding tool it would make. And in particular, they went to Braintree, Massachusetts for this stuff. This is a metamorphosed slate. It's millions of years old, but it happens to have properties where it's somewhat soft, but will hold an edge. And it was used for making tools called adzes, which is a kind of a chisel, a woodworking tool. If one wanted to make a dugout canoe, for example, or a stone bowl dugout, this is the kind of tool that they would use. So that the raw material comes from Braintree, Massachusetts, just where Route, let's see, what is it, 2495, gets onto the Southeast Expressway off to the left-hand side, those quarries. That's where this stuff comes from. So they weren't going too far for this, which tells us they knew the area really well. Another artifact that's floating around, and I'll show you a picture of it, is called a Neville projectile point, made out of what we call Attleboro red felsite, which is a volcanic material that comes from Attleboro, Massachusetts. So these people, we call it, had a knowledge of sedentary lifestyle. They knew the resources in the area, so they were spending time here. So finding these kinds of things on an archaeological site, including the 400 or so pieces of what we call debitage, which is a fancy word for junk, garbage, that's made when people make stone tools, the chips of stone that are broken off when one is manufacturing a stone tool. We found a lot of those on the site. So people were making stone tools on the site, people were using stone tools on the site. Some of the projectile points that we found were made by hunters and collectors, people who were primarily deer hunters and hunters of small game, and they were replenishing their toolkits on the site. So all of this information we're finding from, in particular, the Robbins Pond site and the Pond Street site. I made reference to the question of the alleged burial grounds. One of the ways that we did look for that is to do ground penetrating radar. And as I said, as in Jurassic Park in the movie, you see folks using ground penetrating radar, and they have this lovely picture of a dinosaur. So one would assume that if that holds true, when archaeologists look for graves, they find a very nice rectangular grave shaft, or maybe even skeletal materials, which is not the case. We find ugly little blips that are nothing more than mathematical indicators of fluctuations of different, what we call resistivity, the resistance of the radar wave going through the ground and coming back. When it hits something, it wobbles a little bit mathematically, and we're able to chart that. And some of these mathematical wobbles were intriguing enough for us to investigate whether or not they represented burials. Sometimes, for example, you can go into a colonial burial ground or a 19th century burial ground, and you can get a very good rectangular image on a ground penetrating radar screen. But the further back you go in time, the more time the ground has to reestablish itself, and the more difficult it is to paint a picture with radar. So we had a combination of issues that were telling us we had some possible targets that we might consider as graves, but nothing definitive. And to make a long story short, when we tried to ground truth it with controlled machine excavation, we were not successful in verifying that graves existed in the areas where we did the ground penetrating radar, which was disappointing, but that's life sometimes. When, as I said, we found several areas where there were Native American materials in meaningful context. They were in the same places where people, based on the stone tools and the types of stone tools, who occupied the site, maybe not lived there. Campsites were probably more a descriptive term, where people were spending maybe a few days there, maybe a week there, and then moving on in their hunting territories. But if you do that year after year over several generations, you can imagine how much garbage is accumulated, how many activities take place on a site. Well, we were finding several areas that were intact enough that, to put it in the best way that I can, the developers' dreams were not fulfilled, that we did in fact find materials that they needed to take into consideration if the development was going to move forward. That it's always our recommendation when we find sites that are potentially important or significant, and that the whole terms, just like in law, there are some terms that are much larger than face value. The term significance for archaeologists or anybody who's in the Preservation Commission takes on a whole new meaning legally and nationally, but for us it means if something is significant, that means it's worthy for preservation, it's worthy for consideration to be listed on something called the National Register of Historic Places. There was an act in 1966, and it's been amended several times since, that creates this list in Washington, D.C. of the most important places in the country that are worthy of further research or preservation. And two of the sites at Robbins Pond, based on my recommendations and based on how well we could write a report, were nominated for consideration to be listed on the National Register. So what that means is this is an important place. There are important sites out there, and anything that happens out there in the future, whether it's making a park or building houses, will have to take into consideration the location and the future protection, one way or another, of these sites. This is some of the machine trenches. I hope you see this as being somewhat careful and systematic. We try to be careful when we're out there. I'll go on public record now of saying that once we had done our archaeological work out there and covered the pits back up, enough alterations had taken place out there that Fred was not speaking to me for a little while. That he went out and he was, he felt the promise had not been kept, that we would do things as systematically, as carefully as we could. And I think I didn't probably prepare him for what some of archaeology can do to a site in the short term. And I think we got through that okay, didn't we, Fred? Okay, thanks. But I was in hot water for a while, so I'll admit publicly that I had not prepared probably him or other folks for what they would find if they just dropped in on the site after the machine work. But some of the results of what we're looking at here, and I'll use my arrowhead here, is these are what we call features. Now there are two things on an archaeological site, more than that actually, but two things for purposes of this illustration. There are artifacts, things that you can pick up and carry off the site and study and weigh and analyze and name and so on and so forth. And there are things on the site that you can't pick up and take away, that you have to take apart. That might be buildings or stone walls, or in this case, the bottoms of hearths, fire pits, areas of the landscape that had been altered by the people who have occupied it there. Now that could be a drainage ditch, but it can also be a 7,000-year-old campfire. And in some cases, we didn't find graves, but we did find the evidence of those campfires, of those peoples who had been occupying the site for over 7,000 years. This is several days after our machine trenches were filled back in. I'll go through some of these relatively quickly. These are some of the materials from the Pond Street site. This is the site that is, the pond itself is here, the street is here, so this is pretty much right off the road up on a high bluff. And these are particularly important to us because they are diagnostic tools. If an archaeologist from the future were to look at a snapshot of those of us in the room, based on the style of glasses that you have, based on your shoes, based on the clothing that you're wearing, he or she would be able to come to a pretty accurate, two accurate observations. One, none of us are very cool, and two, that this is the beginning of the 21st century, that this is the style that we're wearing, so on and so forth. Archaeologists have spent more time than we should applying those same principles to stone tools. And having done that for too long, we now know that these points are about 7,000 to 8,000 years old. And as I said, a couple of them are being passed around. Now, the fact that they are broken this way is not coincidence. Basically, if you use your imagination a little bit and consider this arrow shaft and consider these attached to the arrow shaft and the way that it's attached to the arrow would actually protect the bottom half of the point. But in hunting, when a Native American, I'll use the term Indian if I may, apologizing to anyone who might be offended by that term. I don't use it with any intended disrespect. It's just a collective term that works sometimes. But the Indian who shoots the arrow at a game and either hits it and it breaks, or misses the deer and it hits a tree and breaks, the most important part of this whole apparatus is not necessarily the stone point. It can take someone about 20 minutes to make a new one. The important, difficult thing to maintain is the shaft. So you want to retrieve the shaft, you want to take off the old point, make a new one and put it on and put it back in your hunting kit for the next hunting foray. Finding these on the site tells us that that's one of the activities that were taking place here about 7,000 years ago. And that's a pretty cool thing, I think. These are little things that help us time travel. These are keys to the past and that tell us about some of the behaviors and some of the lifestyles and lifeways of the past. This, ladies, if you were, if we were or you were Eskimos or Inuits or Aleuts, people of the far north, you would still, in some cases, be using these. This Nulu is an Inuit name for a woman's knife. Now they're made out of metal for the most part, but up until a short period of time ago, they were made out of stone. They were made out of stone across the northern part of the continent, and they were made out of stone as far south as the Piedmont, New England, and even into other parts of the country. Finding them on the site indicates perhaps, and I don't mean to be oversimplified here, and there's only so much we can't tell the entire richness of a culture just by its stone tools, but if we use some simple formulas, if we assume, for example, that the men were the hunters and the women were processing food and taking care of children, and forgive me if you don't subscribe to that, I'm not looking for any arguments, but if we accept that simple model of the sexual division of labor, then we can maybe assign gender to these different tools and say, finding an ulu, or if use the Eskimo word, the woman's knife, on the site suggests to us that it was not just a group of guys hunting, that it was families. Women were on the site, that means probably families were on the site, so that again gives us some insights into human behaviors and activities thousands of years ago on the site. Now the Robbins Pond site, which is actually about 3,000 years more recent, it's about 3,000 or 4,000 years old. These are what we call small stem points, and these are the styrofoam cups of prehistory. We find these sites everywhere. These are made primarily out of rock that we call quartz and quartzite. There are a lot of them. It's local material that's very hard to work. But these people had been in the air. These might be the descendants of the earlier occupants of the site, for example, in an oversimplified way. But they became so familiar with the materials at hand that they became very good with working the junky stuff like quartz because there was so much of it. And there are thousands and thousands of these points in local collections. So they're not rare necessarily, but finding them on the site, this is called, as it says here, a Lavana point. This is called a Fox Creek point. We name everything, you know. But again, they're diagnostic of what we call the late Archaic and the woodland period. So what it's telling us is, as I said earlier, this was an attractive place for multiple generations over periods of several thousand years, and the research that's available still in the ground here, we only need a very small percentage of the site. The research that's still available in this site makes it worthy of consideration for listing as a national historic property. So that's what we've concluded, that there are significant Middle Archaic sites and they're eligible for the National Register. The Massachusetts Historical Commission, the local commission here in East Bridgewater has agreed with us, and anything that takes place in the site, any further development will need to either preserve the sites in place or include what's called archaeological data recovery. And that's not to say that I'm looking for more work. I would prefer, we would prefer as a community, that the site be preserved in place. But the laws, the way they're written, always gives somebody an out. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but I guess that's the most succinct way to put it. And that out is, if you are responsible for the stewardship, the preservation of the site, and it is not prudent or feasible or in the public interest to preserve the site, then you assume the responsibility to have high-end archaeology. You remove the significant data from the site scientifically. And that's the kind of stuff that you see on the Discovery Channel or on National Geographic or, you know, in the, certainly not Indiana Jones, but when archaeology is being done right, which takes seasons and which takes a great deal of analysis and is very high-end. It's what the archaeology that we've done out there so far in terms of dollars and cents, has been tens of thousands of dollars. When you're talking about archaeological data recovery, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. So someone would have to have the potential for a huge profit market on something. I don't mean to say that this is small potatoes in regards to a development, but relative to the cost-benefit analysis, it might not be worthwhile, for example, to plan on putting houses that are going to cost a couple $100,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 each, if you've got to take half of that or more and pay for archaeology with it. So what's happening now, although I can't speak for the developers, I can't speak for the lawyers, I can't speak for the planning commission or any of the municipalities here, but what I have done is presented everyone with an interesting problem. And that problem is, you've got this important site out there. You've got to either think, somebody's got to think about either preserving it or spending a great deal of money if you're going to impact it. And that's where we stand now. So those of you who are probably wondering, at least from my perspective, that's where we stand now. Those of you who are wondering why this development has not moved forward, that's not to say that it will not. It may move forward in a modified way. I always look for a win-win situation. So my win-win situation would be, well, these sites along Robbins Pond and along the roadway are so important that design around them, that preserve them in place, make that a park, leave it alone, basically, and preserve it for future generations. And that may happen. I know that the designers and the engineers have met with the Massachusetts Historical Commission and with me, and at least listened attentively to that persuasive argument. And they are looking at design plans that might take that into consideration. So I don't know where this is going to go, but I do know that because of the diligence of the Historical Commission here, because of the obvious interest that the community has placed in this particular area, and I think the promise, the excitement of the archaeology, the fact that this is a place that today is important and gives us a sense of being special, that I think there's something of that has survived for 7,000 to 4,000 years out there, and it's maintained a character of an important place, a special place. Now, one other caveat, one other fly in the ointment, or one other thing that seriously has not been put to rest is the lack of evidence is not evidence of absence. So what that means is the question of the Robbins family burial is still very much real in my mind, and I've discussed it with the Office of the State Archaeologist and many times with the developers. And anything that happens out there, until we can verify that it does exist, or we can satisfy ourselves that it does not, and I'm far from there, any even possibly lot by lot work that happens out there has to have protocols that would include the discovery, the unanticipated. It's kind of a oxymoron. You say one thing and mean the other. The name for that is unanticipated discoveries. You have to have a plan in case you discover something that you don't expect to find. But unless you expect to find it, you can't develop the plan. But that is and will be in operation on this property should the development move forward. Having said that, I know I've been talking for about 50 minutes now, and I do have a tendency to ramble. I've gone through a lot of information very quickly here, and it's probably left a number of you unsatisfied. So as long as we can maintain some crowd control with this seemingly unruly group, I'll entertain any questions you may have.
Yeah, my name is Bob Ward. I'm Vice President to the Old Bridgewater Historical Society, and I'm open on Wednesdays from noon to 3.
No advertising, Bob.
Well,
Yeah, we need
to
to.
come in because
Is there a fee to get in?
No.
Just a donation. We do have the collection from Mrs. Waldorf's that the campers found as they were camping and brought to her, and she set up a display case. And we do have that, not at the museum building, but at another location that can be seen from time to time.
Thank you, Bob. Nice job. Mr. Waldorf did indeed do quite a bit of digging, and rumor on the street is that may have included, are we still running the tape?
Yeah.
Okay, that he was a wonderful man, who may have inadvertently come across some skeletal remains. Yes, there was a question here. Yes, sir.
Are there any other archaeological information regarding the Native Americans from any other part of the land? There's been recent development.
Yes, specifically no, in a general sense, yes. That it is an area known to have been collected with some frequency. As I said earlier on, and that's a good thing because we know that a lot of areas yielded artifacts. So we know that there's a sensitivity anywhere you go out there that's relatively elevated, well drained, proximity to water, which eliminates almost nowhere, probably was stepped on or occupied at some time by Native Americans. We know that. The problem, it's not a problem, but one of the circumstances that results from non-professional archaeology is that when amateur archaeologists dig in a place and collect artifacts, they're mostly interested in the artifacts, and it's finders keepers for the most part. They take the collection, they found the material they found in that pit, and they take it home. Very often they don't publish their results, they don't have, or we've lost any really good notes or photographs. So the specific nature and the area-specific nature of which artifacts came from where, we're losing that information as we lose those folks, or as their memory dulls. The one good thing about hiring professional archaeologists is, ethically, we can't own anything that we find. It all goes, into repositories. It's all treated scientifically with a small s, I guess. So we do know that there's a sensitivity. Now there are different, what we call hooks, and this is the legal mumbo jumbo of how I find work. Not everybody has to do an archaeological survey. It will depend on whether or not you have to do environmental impact, if it's large enough, if you're going to impact sensitive resources or endangered resources, or if there are federal monies, if there are Army federal permits involved. All of that stuff triggers compliance. I made reference before to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. All of that triggers archaeological involvement as a planning element of the development. But if you're using your own money on your own land, and you're not using any federal dollars or federal permits, and no graves are involved, you may not be required to do archaeology. So the little 5, 10 house lots, single house lots, usually fall under the radar. So it's likely that in those cases no archaeology was done. There is some larger scale archaeology that's being done not too far away in relationship to some people's hopes for gaming facilities and those sorts of things that are turning up some interesting results.
My question was, 180 degrees around the pond on the square acre site, they just recently developed that. Was there any archaeological
Not to my knowledge.
requirements over there at all?
No.
Not to my knowledge, no.
What triggered it here as opposed to over there?
The way the money is being financed, and the fact that there may be graves there. I know the developer came to us through their lawyers because of due diligence, because of they had coordinated with the Massachusetts Historical Commission because of the concern for graves. And I think that, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the Historical Commission, I think, was putting pressure, and the town was putting pressure on the developer to go the extra mile, to make absolutely sure he had all the bases covered.
Wasn't that mound in the middle supposed to be the burial ground? That's what's done, because it's on some maps.
there are various lines of evidence. There's oral tradition that points to one place. There's the map information that points to another place. And unfortunately, none of these places overlap. So we couldn't go to the place and say, okay, X marks the spot, this is where it is. It was described differently in a number of different documents.
Out of curiosity, you explained about the arrowhead point, but what is the woman's knife for?
Oh, I'm sorry. An ulu, the woman's knife, is for skinning. When, as you all probably know, when you kill an animal and you want to use its hide, you have to tan it. And in order to tan it, you have to remove the hair from one side and you have to remove the fat from the other. And then you subject it to some processes that include bodily fluids that we are all familiar with, but not always comfortable with, to tan it naturally, and that is what a new woman's knife ulu is used for. That's the ugly truth. Yes, sir.
So what I'm wondering, is the island of any particular interest as far as burial site?
It is of interest, but has not been examined. To my knowledge, it's not slated for any impacts or development, but to my knowledge, I don't know.
Within the scope of that property, correct?
It's outside of the scope of the investigation that we discussed tonight.
But it is part of the property.
Yes, but it was not going to be developed. It was going to be open space. So, and and that translates in our minds as to being preserved for the time being. So I don't know. I'm sure it's been collected, but I don't know what's out there.
I'm just wondering if you, in your opinion, you thought that could be a good possible burial site?
In my opinion, it's a sensitive area. Mike Perot is in large part responsible for the good design out there and for taking what I've done into very serious consideration and in his deliberations with the state, with the developers, and certainly with us, has been a first-class gentleman all
Yes,
the
he
way.
is.
So thank you.
I just want to let you know that what is happening out there now is that on meeting with the state, the people that oversee the financial legacy of Evelyn and the people that oversee the church that owns the majority of Evelyn and the real estate consultant have listened to the fellow at the state, Ed Bell, and Ed has suggested that a preservation easement be prepared for these two particular portions of this 40-acre parcel of land. And I think I've pretty well convinced him that that's the way to go. The draft easement has been prepared. We've had recent meetings with the church and the bank on this, and it appears that probably within the next 2 months, we're going to be given the go-ahead to redo the concept, to take the two areas, the Pond Street area and the pond area, and rework the concept for an open space plan that will preserve these areas plus a 100-foot buffer around the pond, except for the beach that's been disturbed, but a 100-foot buffer around the edge of the pond, and preserve that as open space and be under a preservation easement. And that's the concept that's going to come out probably within a couple of months.
That's great.
I'm waiting for the authorization on that. But that's the way that the current thoughts are, and that the church and the bank are going to propose the plan for approval through the town, and then after they get that approved, then put it into the hands of a developer. So it will be the bank and the church pushing the development concept, getting it approved, and then a developer will have to buy onto the plan as proposed. So with the Historical Commission, if you have some thoughts about this, please send it to my office, because again, I'm waiting for authorization. It'll probably happen within a month, and then I'll be working on an overall concept plan. And at that time, part of my proposal is before we even go to the planning board with a formal plan, to come to the Historical Commission and the planning board and the Conservation Commission to show what the concept is before we start into a formal permitting process. So this is good news all around because it's a win-win situation. It calls for full preservation of these two areas.
Wonderful. That isn't what I was going to ask you. But thank you. You did tell us there were two endangered species. One was the freshwater mollusk.
One's the mollusk,
And the other?
other's the blue damselfly.
Blue.
Damselfly.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
We've had our meetings with the program, and they're recommending that we preserve that 100-foot around the pond to allow the dragonfly to be able to fly over the pond and to go into the bushes and the shrubs along the edge of the pond, and that way there they have a place to rest, to feed, and do their thing. Unfortunately, other sections of the pond that have been developed, this is only something new with the damselfly, and those areas were disturbed. And in this project here, we're already under a general agreement with the state to preserve that area, which also overlaps with the pond, the Robbins Pond site. So we'll preserve that area for this endangered species.
But you are all preservationists at heart. Not everyone shares your perspective. In the wrong hands, this becomes a treasure map. So I would recommend that it be made available to the reference desk at the library, and that anyone who would like to look at it reads it in the library and assumes responsibility for their personal ethics.
I also want to say one thing. This was privately paid for, and I really thank you so much, and thank everybody involved, Mike and everybody else, for allowing us to see and hear what they have found. I really am appreciative of it, as is the Historical Commission and Society.
Thank you all for being a great audience.
Thank you.